Hello and welcome to the Starting Necron series, the series where we go from your first purchase to your first 2,000 point army list and everything in between for the Necron forces. The time has finally come where we'll be looking at the 2,000 point army list for the Necron forces, and there's no better time to look at the spooky scary skeleton boys than in October, as we are now right around Halloween. To begin with, I'll say this much, we're going to be looking at lists that have done rather well within tournaments in the last couple of months, and while Necrons aren't the best army anymore, they're definitely one of those armies that's lower middle of the pack. However, they still find their top 4 finishes from time to time, and they have evolved significantly over the course of the meta. This means that most likely all they really need is in the next points adjustment to see a decrease in points across their different units, and they should be able to start competing again and finding themselves making a lot more top 4s. Though as things stand now, they're still perfectly fine, and they can still find their way to the top ends of the tournament scene. So let's get right into the list, and we'll begin by looking at our first list, which was piloted by a player named Matthew Chin, played in the Factorium Sept GT, and he placed second in this 28-player event. So to begin with, this list employs a patrol detachment being composed of the Custom Dynasty, featuring the Eternal Conquerors and Relentless Expansionists. This is by far the most popular dynasty choice at this time, and probably the most playable one, simply because it allows the Necrons to hold objectives incredibly well when using this combination, as well as giving them that little bit of extra mobility that they might lack at times. As such, it's going to be the one we're going to see the most within this video. To begin with the first patrol detachment, this list brings one HQ choice, being the Catacomb Command Barge. This Catacomb Command Barge has chosen to be armed with a Gauss Cannon and has the Warlord trait of Enduring Will and the Relic of Voltaic Staff. This is definitely a perfectly fine choice, as that Enduring Will makes the Command Barge significantly more tanky, and the Relic gives it a lot more damage output. And even though the Catacomb Command Barge saw a minor points increase, it's still very playable and it still does show up in plenty of lists at this time. Now, as this is a patrol detachment, it does require at least one troop choice. In this case, the troop choice is a unit of 5 Immortals being armed with Gauss Blasters. Unfortunately, the points reduction to the Tesla weapons has not made them see any more play, and generally we're starting to see more units of 5 Immortals as a minimum troop choice, as opposed to those large blocks of Necron Warriors. However, large blocks of Necron Warriors do still show up, and we'll see at least one of those lists within this video. Following the troop choice, the patrol detachment brings 2 elite choices, both those elite choices being a unit of 5 Lich Guard, each of those units being armed with swords and shields, as they make the Lich Guard significantly more survivable and are generally the correct choice, as the Necrons have plenty of other ways of putting out damage if they wish to have a unit that has the capabilities of a Lich Guard wielding a scythe. And after the elite choice comes the fast attack choices. In this case, the patrol detachment includes 2 different fast attack choices, the first of those fast attack choices being a unit of 3 Canoptic Wraiths armed with Vicious Claws. This is a perfectly reasonable choice, and it continues on with the survivability and durability theme of this list that we've seen so far with the Catacomb Command Barge and the Lich Guard that we've seen in the elite choices. And once again, the Eternal Conquerors and Relentless Expansionists give these units the ability to move into position and hold it very successfully, thanks to having objective secured on all of their units. The second fast attack choice is where we start to see something interesting, in this case being another unit of 3 Canoptic Wraiths. However, unlike the previous unit, only 2 of those Canoptic Wraiths have Vicious Claws. The third Wraith has Whip Coils and a Beamer upgrade. Normally, a lot of times when you see something like this, it's due to a points restriction. However, in this case, taking the Whip Coil and the Beamer actually makes this Wraith squad more expensive than the previous one. So there's a very conscious choice in terms of bringing that Whip Coil and Beamer along, probably in the event that he needs to clear out some swarm units, as otherwise the list so far is very elite. So that Whip Coil gives him a little bit of ability to put out some damage against larger units, as well as the Beamer giving the same kind of benefits. Finally, to wrap up the first patrol detachment, the list includes 2 heavy choices, each of those heavy choices being composed of 1 Locust Heavy Destroyer armed with a Gauss Destructor, and this is a rather reasonable choice, especially after the points decrease of the Destroyers and Heavy Destroyers. In this situation, the Gauss Destructor gives this list some ability to take out armored targets at a range and with some decent success. Furthermore, splitting up the 2 Locust Destroyers gives them a little bit more survivability and maneuverability that can allow them to do some things that putting them in the same squad wouldn't. In any case, if you have the opportunity to split up a unit such as this, it's something you should always consider because there's definitely benefits to it. However, there are also benefits sometimes to putting them in the same squad as well, as we discussed in the heavy support unit choice video, as there's definitely consideration for both depending on how you want to play the units. Moving along to the second part of this list, we have yet another patrol detachment, which is composed of the Custom Dynasty of Eternal Conquerors and Relentless Expansionists. This second patrol detachment begins with an HQ choice consisting of a Plasmancer. This Plasmancer has an extra trait, an extra relic, and an Arcana option. The Veil of Darkness makes perfect sense on the Plasmancer, as it allows him to get closer to enemy units, and it allows him to move another unit closer to the enemy with him as he goes along. Now the Arcana is something that we haven't seen too much of. In fact, Arcana usage has become rather heavy within recent lists. However, now it seems like Necron lists do make much more use of it. The Subjugator Scarabs allow him to make a unit heroically intervene when a charge is declared, as if that unit was a character. This can be rather useful and can allow a combat to go your way, so there's definitely usages for the Subjugator Scarabs, though I'm not sure how much they're worth the points. However, I can see if you have some points left over, it's definitely a perfectly fine choice to consider. What really doesn't make sense to me is the extra trait that I've chosen to put on this Plasmancer. The extra trait in this case is the Thrall of the Silent King, and while it's a perfectly fine ability in some situations, I do have to wonder what the actual usage of it is, because as far as I know, the abilities of the Plasmancer are not aura abilities, and he doesn't have any of the other abilities that the Thrall of the Silent King benefits. So if anyone knows what I'm missing here, please do let me know, because this is a little strange, and I'm not sure if this is simply an error on the army list or an error importing, but this seems to be the one that popped up in any instance of this list that I could find. I'd be interested to know why this was the trait chosen as opposed to any of the other traits that might have actually had some impact, or if something has changed, or if there were some special rules within this tournament that changed how the Thrall of the Silent King behaved. At this time I'm perfectly baffled, so maybe someone can help me out on this one. Anyway, moving on from the Plasmancer, he does come with a unit of Bound Creations, which is a unit of 2 Crypto Thralls, and Crypto Thralls have been seeing a significant amount of play from the beginning to this time. And the reason being, as we discussed within the Elite video, they're a rather impactful unit that puts out quite a good amount of damage when next to a Cryptech, and has a decent amount of resilience to hold objectives, especially when featured in the custom dynasty of Eternal Conquerors and Relentless Expansionists. I definitely think Crypto Thralls are here to stay, and we'll see that they're a commonplace within almost every list, overtaking almost all other units in terms of how often they see play. Now moving along, we come to the mandatory troop choice that patrol detachments are required to take, once again being a unit of 5 Immortals armed with Gauss Blasters. As mentioned before, the unit of 5 Immortals is very common nowadays, simply because they're the cheapest troop choice that you can put within a list to allow yourself to have access to more elite choices and fast attack choices. In terms of elite choices, this list has chosen to go with 2 units of 3 Scorpic Destroyers armed as they must be with 2 Threshers and 1 Reaper. Scorpic Destroyers are definitely a fine choice for putting out damage while having a bit of resilience, and they go hand in hand with the Lich Guard and Canoptic Wraiths these days, as they can put out a decent amount of damage while being decently stable at holding objectives. However, this list has gone one step further by bringing a single Plasmacite as a viral construct in order to help those destroyers out in combat by giving them their buff. I do think the Plasmacist is a sign of something happening within Necrons, as we'll see more lists included than just this one. And the reason being is that it seems like maybe some of the damage output issues of the Necrons is starting to show, because the Plasmacist does give you a lot of power, but it comes with a rather reasonable risk attached to it. So as you see a lot of Plasmacites within lists, it does show that the Necrons are trying to find different ways to put out more damage at the risk of destroying their own units. However, this isn't the end of the world, and I do think the Plasmacite does have a place within tournaments. It's just one of those things that always makes me a little nervous when I would use that ability. Finally, this patrol detachment wraps up with 2 fast attack choices. Both those fast attack choices being a unit of 5 Praetorians being armed with a Rod of the Covenant. I'm personally not the biggest fan of Praetorians due to the lack of survivability choices, but their damage output is definitely reasonable, and they have pretty decent mobility considering the other Necron forces. I will say this, it's kind of interesting to look at these 2 patrol detachments side by side, as one of the patrol detachments is definitely the more tanky one, and the other is definitely the damage output one. However, there's one more part to this list, and one that you'll oftentimes see alongside the Triarch Praetorians being a super heavy detachment. This super heavy detachment includes the Silent King. As we all know, the Silent King has the unique ability to buff Triarch Praetorians and give them benefits that other HQ choices cannot do. As such, the Silent King and the Triarch Praetorians go hand in hand together as they're units that complement each other rather well. In addition to that, the Silent King in himself is an incredibly powerful unit that has a heavy amount of damage output and can destroy a lot of armor targets that Necrons might otherwise have an issue destroying. Combine the Silent King with those 2 heavy destroyers and you definitely have a lot more output than Necrons normally have when targeting units with heavy armor profiles. As such, I definitely think this list is very interesting as it has a lot of resilience and a lot of damage output with the different types of units that it has chosen. In addition to that, it has that very powerful centerpiece unit known as the Silent King and brings a Catacomb Command Barge as well as a Plasmancer to put out some additional mortal wounds. All in all, it's interesting to see a list such as this, as it brings a little bit of everything to the table and definitely shows the ability for the Necron list to be very diverse in terms of what they bring to the table. In addition to that, while Necrons don't have the most upgrade choices, it is interesting to see the use of a single whip coil wraith, and it'd be interesting to find out why that was the case, as normally wraiths aren't armed with such weapons, and having only one does raise some questions. Though I will mention that while this list brings a lot of diverse units, we'll see that this is very commonplace within the meta for Necrons currently, simply because they have to rely on a diversity of units more so than any static build that some other armies can get away with. This might simply be because they don't have any units that fill multiple roles, but rather each unit has a specific role that it can fill, and it fills that role rather well, but when you face certain armies, you might find yourself having a hard time of dealing with certain threats if you don't bring such a diversity of units that we see in this list. Now that we've taken a look at our first list, let's move on to our second list. In this case, the second list will once again begin with a patrol detachment and once again be composed of the Eternal Conquerors and Relentless Expansionist Custom Dynasty. However, unlike the first list, the first HQ choice of this patrol detachment is an Overlord. In this case, the Overlord is the warlord of this army, and as such he has a trait and a relic to go along with that. The relic this Overlord has is the Void Reaper, which gives him quite a serious amount of damage output, as well as the ability to crack some heavy armor targets thanks to the amount of armor penetration and special rules of the Void Reaper. In addition to the Void Reaper, the trait that this Overlord has is the Eternal Madness trait, and the Eternal Madness trait gives him the ability to reroll wounds, once again helping him to put out quite a good amount of damage within melee combat with that Void Reaper. All in all, I would say this is definitely an interesting Overlord that has a lot of capability to put out a good amount of damage. Though this isn't anything that we haven't seen in the past, as the Void Reaper is something that does show up once in a while, though Eternal Madness is a little bit of a different ability that isn't as common as, say, some other traits. In any case, an interesting start to a list, and the second HQ choice is a Plasmancer, in this case being armed with an extra relic and an Arcana. The relic that this Plasmancer has is a Veil of Darkness, and as mentioned previously, the Veil of Darkness allows him, as well as another core unit, to get within close range of an enemy unit by teleporting himself and using his ability to generate mortal wounds. Speaking of mortal wounds, the Arcana that the Plasmancer is given is the Quantum Orb, and what the Quantum Orb does is allows him to mark a location on the table within 24 inches, and in the next turn, that location is hit by a force, and any unit within 6 inches of that location suffers mortal wounds, depending if certain conditions are met. This is definitely one of those abilities that can generate some mortal wounds, though unfortunately it does give the enemy a lot of time to move away from that position and not suffer any losses. Though that being said, at times it can help push people off of objectives if you mark that objective, or at the very least it'll put a couple mortal wounds on them and allow you to start putting more pressure on that unit holding that objective. And for the amount of points it is, I probably wouldn't take it, but I can definitely see the argument for why someone would take it. For the single troop choice of this patrol detachment, unlike the other one, the player decided to go with a unit of 20 Necron warriors, showing that a large block of warriors still has room within the meta to compete, and it's not just units of 5 immortals that see play nowadays. The one interesting thing about these warriors is that they're armed with Gauss Flares instead of Gauss Reapers, and while the Gauss Flare is definitely a reasonable choice, there is something to be said when you have a Veil of Darkness in your list, as the Veil of Darkness really does enable you to do a lot more with the Gauss Reapers, though at the end of the day, it's perfectly fine to take the Gauss Flares over the Gauss Reapers if you want, as there's definitely pros and cons to both, and I wouldn't say one is more superior than the other. It's just that I would personally prefer the first 20 Gauss Reapers when a Veil of Darkness is in play over the Gauss Flares, which can be found on other units, though in the case of this list, as we'll see in the future, it's not exactly the worst choice, as the list does have plenty of damage output. Now, to wrap up this patrol detachment, there are 2 elite choices, and in this situation, those 2 elite choices are just 2 units of Crypto Thralls. And once again, this shows that the Crypto Thralls have a lot more capability than just being bound creations. One thing I'll say about the Crypto Thralls is that they can be used very effectively in place of things like Scarabs, as Scarab swarms are a little fragile and don't necessarily have as much damage output as the Crypto Thralls can have. As such, some Necron players have chosen to bring Crypto Thralls in place of Scarabs as their general objective holder, and it really comes down to preference and what the rest of your list has. I definitely say there's reason to bring Crypto Thralls in some situations, as they give you that more resilient unit with a little bit more damage output, and they count as less units on the field and less wounds as a whole, making them a little better for certain objectives and certain missions. Though that being said, Scarabs do have some other interactions, though once again, you're probably going to have a Cryptek, so those Crypto Thralls can put out a decent amount of damage once they're within range of that Cryptek. And once again, it's your choice to make, and there's definitely a reason to bring one or the other, or even both within a list. It's not exactly a mutually exclusive choice, so do keep an open mind and don't just default to Scarabs when making a choice for a unit to fill that specific role. Where this list becomes a lot more interesting is in the second half of the list. As opposed to a second patrol detachment, this list goes for a vanguard detachment, meaning that's going to go a little heavier on the elite choices than other lists would. However, once again, this vanguard detachment is Eternal Conquerors and Relentless Expansionists. As all detachments do, this list begins with an HQ choice, being that of a Scorpic Lord. A Scorpic Lord has definitely gained a lot more value as time has gone on, considering the points increase of the Catacomb Command Barge, giving the Scorpic Lord a little bit more of a niche than he had before when he was almost the same cost as a Catacomb Command Barge. I do think both of them are decently good options. However, I would have liked to see a decrease in the points cost of the Scorpic Lord as opposed to a points increase of the Catacomb Command Barge. This Scorpic Lord is armed with an extra trait and an extra relic. The extra trait in this situation being that of Enduring Will, which is often taken on units such as a Scorpic Lord or the Catacomb Command Barge, as they're already rather resilient, and the trait of Enduring Will makes them all the more tanky and an absolute nightmare for your opponents to fight. The relic in this situation is definitely one that we haven't seen yet, and that is the Gauntlet of the Conflagrator. And normally this relic would not be that interesting, but we are seeing a lot more large squads, such as units of 20 Skitarii or those 20 Necron warriors, and so forth and so on. As such, this Gauntlet can actually do a bit of damage, as what it does is it simply targets a unit and has one pistol shot, meaning that it can still be fired within close combat, but it doesn't actually have any damage profile. Instead, you roll a d6 for every model within the unit targeted by the Gauntlet, and for every 6 that unit suffers a mortal wound. Obviously, this isn't very good if all the units you're targeting are rather small, because when you're targeting units of 5 models, you're probably on average going to get at best 1 mortal wound. However, if you're targeting a unit of 20, you're going to generate about 3 mortal wounds, and considering that you can do this every single turn, that does add up rather quickly, and as we've seen already, things like the Plasmancer are becoming more popular because the Necrons are moving more towards a mortal wound generation style of play, and this is actually rather interesting because this is something that's consistent both in the first list and the second list that we've seen so far. In fact, we'll see an extension of this in the third list, however in a little bit of a different way than we see in the first 2 lists. Now, because this is a Vanguard detachment, it does not require to take any troop choices, and this Vanguard detachment has not taken any. Instead, this detachment goes straight to the elite choices, and those elite choices are 2 units of 6 Scorpic destroyers, and 2 units of 1 Plasmacite each to accompany those Scorpic destroyers. Once again, we see that the Plasmacite has become a common item within the different Scorpic destroyer lists. The Plasmacite wasn't something we really saw in early meta lists of Necrons when Scorpic destroyers were included, or if we did see it, it was something that was rather rare. Though once again, this might indicate some of the damage output issues that Necrons might have, and would give more credence towards decreasing some of the points on some of the models of the Necrons. Though that being said, it's interesting to see the larger units of Scorpic destroyers are still in play, especially with that Scorpic Lord who can definitely benefit them in several different ways. Moving along from the Scorpic destroyers and Plasmacites, the 5th and final lead choice of this list is a single Catan Shard of the Nightbringer, being armed with the Catan power of Antimatter Meteor. And while this isn't exactly the most exciting inclusion, as the Nightbringer saw a lot of play early on, it's definitely something to make note of, as once again it shows that the Necrons are bringing a little more power units to the table, such as the Silent King or this Catan Shard, and are bringing units that can generate those mortal wounds, as the Catan units can definitely generate a decent amount of mortal wounds with their Catan powers, as well as different stratagems and their general abilities, with the Nightbringer being one of the better ones to generate those mortal wounds. So we already see 3 different units that are very capable of generating mortal wounds in this army list, such as the Plasmancer, the Scorpic Lord with the Gauntlet of the Conflagrator, and the Nightbringer in this case. In comparison to the previous list, this list definitely does go a lot more heavier on the damage output with those Scorpic destroyers and the ability to generate mortal wounds with the different units that it has. Finally, to wrap up this list, there are 2 heavy choices, and unlike the previous list, this list has chosen to bring some more mid-range firepower, in this case being 2 units of 5 Locust Destroyers. This is actually quite a large number of Locust Destroyers, and it shows that both the Locust Heavy Destroyer and the Locust Regular Destroyer do have a lot of capability to see play within the meta. I do think the points increase definitely helped them see play, as they were seeing fringe play before the points increase happened, and now they seem to be showing up a lot more commonly within different lists, whether it's the heavy or the regular type. In this situation, because this list has a lot of mortal wound capability and a lot of damage as it stands already, the regular destroyers are definitely a reasonable include, as they can provide that mid-range firepower that this list might otherwise lack. I definitely like seeing them see play, and it's definitely a prediction that I made when I was making the heavy support video before the points change happened that ended up panning out very well in terms of what I believe would happen if they decrease the points slightly, and considering at the time they were very uncommon to see, now they're seeing a significant amount more play. I definitely didn't see the meta shaping up as it did now, but I do think there are some predictions that you can generally make when you're looking at certain units, even if it's impossible to predict where the meta is going to be in its entirety. Anyway, once again, it's interesting to see the variety of different units within a Necron list such as this, and it shows that a lot of the Necron units do have a lot of viability within the game as a whole. As we'll see in the next and final list, there's definitely a lot more variety that can still be had within the Necron forces. And finally we come to the third and final list of this video. As always, I like to save the most interesting list for last, and this one is definitely no exception to that. In fact, this is probably the list that caught my eye the most and the one I wanted to talk about the most, as it has so many interesting choices that I didn't expect to see. To begin with, this list placed in 4th place in a 30-player event, piloted by a player named Dennis Naberzink in the Kent War Games GT. To begin the third list, like the other lists, this list begins with a patrol detachment composed of the Eternal Conquerors and Relentless Expansionists, a rather boring beginning to what's otherwise a very interesting list. For the HQ choice of this patrol detachment list has chosen to go with a Chronomancer. This is the first instance of a Chronomancer we've seen within one of these lists, as the other ones included Plasmancers instead. And this Chronomancer is armed with an Entropic Lance, despite the points increase, as that's definitely one of the better choices for the Chronomancer and the Cryptex as a whole, and it does give a little bit of armor penetration to the Necron forces. As we've seen with the other Cryptex, the Chronomancer is armed with a relic known as the Veil of Darkness, and it would be very surprising to see a list that did not include the Veil of Darkness on some kind of support unit such as one of the Cryptex. Though where this list becomes a little bit interesting is on the Warlord trait of this Chronomancer. This Chronomancer has the Warlord trait known as Inspiring Leader. And for those of you unfamiliar with this Warlord trait, it's one that I never thought I would see on one of the units within a top 4 tournament list. And the reason for that being is it's from the core rulebook, and all it does is gives units within a certain range +1 to their leadership. And while at first it seemed like a bit of a fluke, it does make a little more sense as we start seeing the rest of the list. However, before we get to that point, we have to also take into account the 2 Crypto Thralls that are following the Chronomancer as bound creations within this HQ choice, and as such they do not take up a unit slot. Once again, Crypto Thralls are a mainstay of almost any list, and that's simply because of how points efficient they are and how good they are as a whole. They're not the best unit in the game, but they kind of do a little bit of everything for how many points they cost. After the HQ choice, we come to our first troop choice, which is once again that unit of 5 Immortals armed with Gauss Blasters. This is once again a decently fine unit to take to fill up a troop choice without expanding too many points and having a decently powerful unit on your side of the table, as Immortals are not weak by any means, even when taken in a small unit of 5 Immortals. Following the troop choice, we come to the lead choice. In this situation, the first lead choice is a unit of 8 Lich Guard being armed with swords and shields, as once again that's kind of really the only option they can be armed with, because their other option simply is a little bit too fragile due to their slow movement speed, and there are simply better options for damage output within the Necron forces, whereas the sword and shield combination gives you a good amount of damage output and a fantastic amount of resilience. Not only that, but with the Veil of Darkness you can definitely get them into position and hold that position incredibly well. For the second lead choice, this list has taken a unit of 5 Flayed Ones, most likely serving as objective goons and being able to put out a little damage, as opposed to being a unit that actually goes into combat and fights very heavily. Though there is one thing to mention about the Flayed Ones that normally does not really come into play. Please remember that they do have a leadership aura that normally isn't that big of a deal, but we've already seen that the Warlord, being the Chronomancer, has taken an ability that increases the leadership of friendly units. So clearly there's something going on with leadership with this list, though it hasn't really come to full fruition yet, as the leadership benefits of the Flayed Ones in conjunction with that trait is not something you would normally go into simply for those 2 things combined, especially when you consider that this unit of Flayed Ones is so small. Now, this patrol detachment wraps up with 2 fast attack choices, being that the first attack choice is a unit of 8 Scarab Swarms, and the second fast attack choice is a unit of 7 Scarab Swarms. This does show that the Scarab Swarms are alive and well in the meta, and that the Crypto Thralls haven't pushed them out completely, but it also does show that the Crypto Thralls go perfectly hand in hand with the Scarabs, as both of them can be rather good within the same list. Moving on to the second half of this list, and the more exciting part of the list, despite the first part of the list being rather exciting, is that the second part of the list is a Spearhead detachment being composed of the Zarkon Dynasty. In this situation, we're seeing a mixed list of different detachments of different dynasties. This does mean this list gives up protocol benefits, but it does gain access to the benefits of the Zarkon Dynasty choice, in addition to the Eternal Conquerors and Relentless Expansionists. This means that it can park those Lich Guard while using the Zarkon forces to deny psychic powers and get some minor rerolls. Now let's look at what the Spearhead detachment includes. The HQ choice of the Spearhead detachment is once again a Cryptech, in this case being a Psychomancer. This is probably the first instance of a Psychomancer I've seen within the top 4 list, and it definitely caught my eye. More so, the Psychomancer comes armed with an Arcana, being armed with an Out of Indicator and an Abyssal Lance. The Out of Indicator is actually a rather interesting piece of Arcana, and what it does is that the Psychomancer can target an enemy unit, and if it beats the enemy unit's leadership in a roll, it deals a certain number of mortal wounds. So once again, we're seeing that access to mortal wounds, and we're starting to see some of the benefits of those leadership modifiers on the units we saw in the patrol detachment. Clearly things are starting to come together, but this wouldn't be the only thing that leadership matters on, and we'll soon see that in the rest of the list. This Psychomancer, kinda like his Chronomancer counterpart, does come with 2 Crypto Thralls as his bound creations, so in this situation we have 2 units of Crypto Thralls and 2 units of Scarab Swarms. This means this list is very good at holding objectives, though do remember that the Spearhead detachment does not have objectives secured, and does not have that early game movement, unlike the first part of the list, which had the custom dynasty benefits. That gives that ability to really get onto objectives and hold them once on there. The rest of this detachment is rather interesting as it comes with 2 elite choices, and both elite choices are ones that caught my eye very heavily. The first elite choices is the Catan Shard of the Deceiver, being armed with the ability of the Sky of Falling Stars for its Catan power. Like the previous list, the Catan powers are definitely good at generating mortal wounds, and that's definitely a prevailing theme within all 3 of these lists. However, one thing I'll mention about the Sky of Falling Stars is that it's definitely better against large units than small units, and that makes a lot of sense because this list probably has some difficulty dealing with some large swarmy units, so the ability to put out a decent amount of mortal wounds against larger blocks of units thinks this Catan power is definitely good, though there is something more to be said about this Deceiver, and that is, if you remember from the Elite video where we did cover the Deceiver's special Catan power does use leadership in order to generate mortal wounds as well, and it's the ability that can generate the most number of mortal wounds, given that your leadership is very high and your opponent's leadership is very low. So now all of a sudden it makes a lot more sense as to why you have that leadership buff and that leadership decrease from the flayed ones, in addition to that Psychomancer who also has leadership interactions. So as we can see, this list actually took something that's normally not very interesting within a game and found a way to extrapolate on it that is very interesting in itself. So I have to give a lot of props to the player who came up with this, as all of a sudden stacking all of those different leadership modifiers does give you the ability to generate even more mortal wounds with that very powerful ability of the Deceiver. So it's taking a lot of units and a lot of abilities that are normally not that great and combining them together to do something rather exciting. I don't know if it's enough to get everything working quite consistently, and if your opponent is expecting what you can do with those flayed ones, as well as what you can do with some of these other units, it might not be very successful, as they can probably stop you before you can get everything set up in order to put out that critical amount of damage. However, in some situations, it can be a very interesting gimmick and a very fun thing to pull off when you do get it off. So while I don't think it's necessarily enough to really push me into it, I do have to give it a lot of props for being as creative as it is, and I do think all of the pieces are perfectly fine within themselves, as there are a lot of different situations in which you can use all of those components, except for maybe that Warlord trait of Inspiring Leader, which I do think could have probably been something else and still been perfectly fine in terms of what you can do. Anyway, moving on from the Catan Deceiver onto the second elite choice of this list. Actually, wait a minute, I think I made a little bit of a mistake when I was formatting this list. It's not a second elite choice, it's in fact a first fast attack choice, in this case being the Ophidian Destroyers. The Ophidian Destroyers are not a bad unit, though I do think they're outshadowed by the Canoptic Wraiths and even Scorpic Destroyers. They're probably also a bit worse than something like the Canoptic Spider, though they are still a fine choice that does see play on occasion as a utility unit. The Ophidian Destroyers do have some capabilities in terms of deep strike and things like that. I do think there are better choices for that, though the Ophidian Destroyers can still put out an okay amount of damage within melee combat, so they're probably not as fringe as I made them out originally, and it's interesting to see them within a list like this, so it's kind of cool to see them showing up and playing a bit of a part in their own right. So maybe there's a little more room for them within the meta than I originally gave them credit for as well. Anyway, moving on, we come to the heavy support choices of the Spearhead attachment that makes up the bulk of this attachment. In this situation, this list has taken 3 Doomsday Arcs for its first 3 heavy support choices, and Doomsday Arc is definitely a fine choice after its points decrease, as it brings quite a lot of light firepower thanks to those Gauss Flare arrays, as well as having a rather powerful cannon that can be okay even if not supercharged. I do think I like Doomsday Arc a little bit more in the Eternal Conquerors and Relentless Expansionist detachment more than a Zarkon or a Mephrit detachment. The reason being is that generally it's a rather resilient unit that can park on an objective and hold it rather well, while defending against most swarm units thanks to those Gauss Flare arrays. As such, I think the ability to hold that objective a little better is definitely more important than having minor access to some of the abilities that something like the Zarkon Dynasty gives. That being said, I've seen a lot of different versions running heavy vehicle lists with a lot of Doomsday Arcs and other vehicles such as this that do employ in different dynasties, so there's definitely room to experiment with that. Finally, the last heavy support choice is a Forge World model being the Tesseract Arc, armed with 2 particle beamers in order to keep the cost low and give it that little bit of light firepower, as opposed to going with the Gauss cannons that would give it a little bit more heavy firepower. In this case, it's most likely a cost-saving measure, as this list is probably rather tight on points and has very little place to cut points due to all of its squads being minimum size, except for the Lich Guard squad and the Scarab Swarms, which do benefit from the larger squad sizes and are probably a backbone to this list to some extent, making them rather hard to reduce in size. As a whole, the Tesseract Arc is definitely fine and helps get you to a critical mass of vehicles within a list such as this. I have seen versions of heavy vehicle lists for Necrons that do employ things like the Annihilation Barge as opposed to the Tesseract Arc, and while the Tesseract Arc is definitely better, that does show you that there's ability to kind of swap things out, or you can even go for the Catacomb Command Barge, which probably is a better choice than the Annihilation Barge when you're first building that list, and it would be interesting to see if there's a return of vehicle lists which employed multiple Command Barges, multiple Doomsday Arcs, and multiple Tesseract Arcs, or multiple Annihilation Barges in one list in order to basically sit on objectives and be very annoying to destroy for your opponent. In any case, this is definitely a very interesting list that once again employs a strategy that probably isn't very common to most players and brings a variety of units that we didn't see in the previous two lists. More so, it's the first instance that I've seen a Psychomancer and a Catan Deceiver make it to the top 4 of a tournament, showing that there's a lot of room to experiment with some of these units that aren't commonly played within the Necron forces. I do think it's an interesting list, and I do think there's a lot of potential for tweaking a strategy like this to be more optimized and to see a top 4 again within the future. Now that we've taken a look at these different lists, I would like to make a few notes before I wrap up this video. There was one list that I did not include that I was originally thinking of potentially including, that being a rather standard list that included 2 Chronomancers, 2 Command Barges, and several units of 20 Necron Warriors, as well as a couple units of Canoptic Wraiths. This list placed in the top 4 around July, so it's been a little time since it was there, and while it did represent sort of a stock standard list of Necron forces, I didn't really want to show it because it was a little boring, and it's been a good amount of time since it placed in the top 4, meaning that the meta has changed significantly since that time. Whereas these 3 lists placed in the top 4 within the last couple months, and as such they're more recent, while showing a more direct configuration of what the meta looks like right now. It is interesting to note how much the Necrons have changed over the course of this meta, as they started with that kind of stock standard build and evolved into sort of vehicle lists as well as elite lists, while now they're more of a variety list that includes a lot of different units as opposed to any kind of maximization of one unit or the other. It's also interesting to note that different characters pop up from time to time, such as the different Catan shards and even some of the special name characters such as Luminar Xeris, though at the end of the day it seems like the standard HQ choices are here to stay. I will say that some of the Necron forces can definitely see a points decrease, and they'd be better for it, so much so that Necrons would have access to a lot more choices. I do think it's good to see that even a small change in points in the Locust Destroyers, for example, has given them a lot more life than they had previously. One thing I will say that the Necrons probably really do suffer from is that they don't really have a lot of choices in terms of the war gear that their units are equipped with, as a lot of times you don't have any choices at all, and other times one of the choices is clearly superior. Maybe in the future, it would be good if they experimented with some different loadouts to give some of their units a little bit more life in the grand scheme of the game, as sometimes it's nice to be able to magnetize units and switch them around so that you have a lot more longevity in terms of what you can bring to the table. And here's a question for all of you guys listening: which of these 3 lists did you find the most interesting, and what lists do you think are still out there to be built that people might not have looked into but could have possibility, as Necrons do have a lot of untapped potential? I will be revisiting the Necrons in the future as the meta changes, and at the very least I'll probably do a follow-up within the next 3 months or so to see how the meta has changed, if at all, and to see where things are panning out, or if there's any interesting developments as time goes on. And as always, if you've enjoyed the content, like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel out, and if you get the opportunity, please do share the channel, as that not only massively helps the channel, but also helps the people who may discover it and benefit from the content. I would also like to give a quick shout out to my patrons. You guys are awesome people. Thank you very much for supporting the channel, and regardless if you're a patron or not, thank you for watching, and have a great day. See you next time. Bye.